let's do this. We are.
Oh, I have to say continue, I guess, or something.
Yeah, you should be okay. All right, we are. It's a live event. Hey, everybody, welcome back to the 1455 interview. I'm Sean Murphy, the executive director of 1455. Appreciate you tuning in. I say this a lot because I mean it, but there are different people that I've talked to that I've either admired for a long time or known. This is one of both. I won't mention how long I've known our esteemed guest, but I'll read the bio and you can put some pieces together looking at both of our faces. But let me introduce a legend to everyone that knows him, William Miller, also known by everyone as Bill. So I will call him Bill, like everyone else does. He directed the MFA program in creative writing at George Mason University from 1992 until his retirement a couple of years ago. He built it into the successful writing community it is today. He transformed the Fall for the Book Festival from an exciting idea into a living, breathing annual event with a capital E. Absolutely something that everyone admires, and I took no small inspiration from in my own modest way as I planned the 1455 Lit Fest. He helped get the then brand new and still new Stillhouse Press off the ground, among too many other projects to mention. This bio is almost insultingly brief as those that know him and his achievements, but we'll get to some of that stuff during the conversation. And most importantly, I think he taught. Ever since leaving his job as a journalist in the mid-'80s to get an MFA, from 1985 until 2018, he was teaching students every spring and fall at George Mason University, which is how I first came to meet him a few years ago. He was named Faculty Member of the Year in 2015, has been widely published, and is without a question a friend and hero to many, this writer very much included. Now semi-retired, he lives with his wife in North Carolina. Bill, it's always a pleasure to see your face. As I just said before we came on the air, when I first met you, you were rocking that beard, and both of our beards were a little bit darker in color then, but here we are all these years later. It's great to see you.
Well, thank you. And you're right, it was a lot darker then. And in fact, I went for a number of years where I didn't have it because I got scared how light it was getting. You know, it was, snow on the chin here. And then my wife and I went to Italy, and, all the guys there had beards of some form. It was just amazing. And I just got inspired. And older guys, younger guys, didn't matter. They weren't bothered by it. So I just sort of, went with it. And then we came back because Hurricane Florence had hit while we were gone, and there was no time to shave. So I went for like weeks without really asking the question, do I want to keep the beard or not? So I finally decided it was too late to ask the question. So I just kept it. And now here I am, the old white-haired guy, except that, I've lost a little on the front, but the color on top is holding it. So now I look really weird.
Clean living. No, you got a little, like the forecast calls for flurries with a tsunami of gorgeous auburn on top.
See, but it's backwards because the snow is supposed to be on the peak, right? Right?
That's how all iconoclasts roll, Bill. So
exactly.
Why do it?
Yeah.
Why do it the normal way? All right.
Well, I've never been one for doing things the normal way.
That's right. And more power to you. All right, I'm putting this on the clock, although I reserve the right to let these go as long as they need to go. But
all right.
I will just introduce it by saying, for someone that taught me pieces that are now, integral to my life for the first time, suffice it to say, I've been dying to hear some of the answers to these questions.
Okay.
And for once, the professor becomes the pupil. So this is great. So let's start with the top. What is the first book that either made you want to write or a book that changed your life?
I've wanted to write for so long. I mean, when I was a kid, I started off wanting to write. So I don't know. I mean, probably something like, Steinbeck's book or something like that very early on. I was reading some of those. and just sort of loving the way he created scenes and characters and stuff like that. So that's probably, I'd probably go to that. But then when I was in sort of upper elementary school, I really read just a lot of biographies, and a lot of them about writers, a lot of them about Lincoln as president, you know, and so I really developed a kind of hero worship. And some of the heroes were writers, and some of the heroes were just, you know, the subject of writers. And so I just sort of wanted to, you know, to be like them, I guess. And so I did have a journalism career, and lasted, I don't know, 16, 17 years. And that was a lot of fun. And I saw myself there kind of bridging that gap, you know, doing a lot of writing about people that I admired, or political people or stuff like that. And I finally sort of ran out of steam on that when I got to Washington and realized those guys didn't deserve always to be looked up upon as heroes. And it was sort of like, wanted to do something a little bit more substantive than that.
Beautiful. Yeah. And then, well, and that led you right on the trajectory that you stayed on for decades,
Yeah.
quite profoundly. Okay. I know this is going to be a tough one for you, but if you could, who would you say your most profound artistic influence is?
Well, you know, I had a chance to study with some great writers when I was in the Mason writing program, and then to work with them as colleagues. The most profound, you know, I learned a lot from Richard Bausch. You know, there's a real artist in short fiction, and Dick can take a short story and he can start off neutral point and have you laughing and laughing and laughing, and then pull it together in a resonating moment at the end, you know. He's got one where this young woman is having a conversation with her father, and she's telling him she's getting, you know, she's engaged, and she's going to marry this guy. And he's like, well, you know, don't I get a say in that and stuff like that? And she's going back and forth. And then she, you know, has to tell him that it's her English professor. And then he's like, oh, that's a cliche. And then she has to tell him that, you know, he's retired, so he's that much older than she is. And then she has to tell him the reason she's doing it is that this older guy has gotten her pregnant. And, you know, and you're just laughing and laughing and laughing. And then the daughter says, well, didn't you say at the beginning of this conversation you had something you wanted to tell me? And he said, yeah, but it'll wait. And so they go on talking, and what he wanted to say was that he and her mother are splitting up, and he can't bring himself to say that. And so they get angry at each other, and she hangs up, and then she calls him back and she says, you have to tell me what it was. He said, no, I'm not going to tell you. But then the moment in the story is he looks out the window and he sees his wife out there, and, you know, and he just sort of talks about, there's a bit of a soliloquy where he sort of looks out and he says, you know, how do you deal with things, you know, and he had told his daughter as they were getting angry at each other, you know, don't go away angry. There's always time to work on stuff. And that line comes back to him, that, you know, as he looks at his wife that he wants to leave, and says, there's always an opportunity to work on stuff. I mean, it's just a great story. It's a real gem.
You know, I'm so glad that you invoked Dick. I was fortunate enough to have him several times. And, you know, in addition to what anyone that knows him knows, that he's an accomplished and revered writer, but, you know, he was, I think to this day, maybe without an ounce of pretension, I mean, as you well know, but that was the most well-read, when we'd be talking in workshops, he would, like a rabbit hat, just be pulling out quote after quote. I mean, talking extensive quotes, like he had been a Jesuit, you know, like a monk, that his only job was to focus on memorizing literature, but just an unbelievable, and as an impressionable student, what that always inspired in me was that here was a guy that wasn't phoning it in.
Right.
Just, I had a passion for the literary life,
Right.
and, you know, it was just like a fire that he lit in everybody's hearts.
Yeah. And he read everything broadly and deeply, and he never forgot a thing. Never forgot a thing.
Yeah, I mean, it was unbelievable. I'll go another quick aside. I went to see him before summer break and was telling him that I was thinking it was time for me to dive into War and Peace because I had the summer. And he, without another word, took out a bunch of pieces of paper and started sketching. Well, here's how you're going to want to read it. And he started sketching out like basically a Cliff's Notes to help me get through it. To me, that's the essence of him right there. His enthusiasm, but also wanting to teach. And again, in a very heartful, soulful way.
Right. There was a famous New Yorker cartoon where Tolstoy's sitting across from an agent editor type and saying, "I told you, you can write about war, you can write about peace, but you can't write about both in the same book." That Cliff Note thing probably got you through and into a deeper level of understanding than you would have had without it.
For sure. Yep.
Yeah.
All right, back to you. How about an album or movie or both that you recommend without reservation?
Movie Casablanca.
It's the first time that's come up in this series, I think, which is surprising.
Yeah.
Surprising. But yeah, impossible to argue with that. Possible.
Yeah, I mean, I could explain. I mean, I'm old, I'm a romantic, and it's old and it's a romantic movie.
Yeah. Well, it endures, it stays.
Right. But the characterization, I think, is really well done. And you oftentimes don't get that level of characterization in contemporary movies. But they go for a kind of a gimmick, it seems to me. But that one really did a lot for character portrayal, and the plot works out of the characters without contrivance and without external influences that come and blow things up, so to speak, literally or figuratively on the screen. And yet you have a very explosive situation. You're dealing with a war, and yet the explosions are all within the human heart.
Yeah. Ooh, beautiful line. Nice.
I'll write that down.
All right. This is probably going to kill you, but in a good way. If you had to pick, and you have to pick, what would you nominate as the best first or last line of any book ever?
Well, you may have heard me say this, but one of my favorite first lines is from Tolstoy, Anna Karenina. All happy families are alike. Unhappy families are unhappy in their own way. One of my oft-repeated short lessons over and over and over again was all happy families are alike. Therefore, we don't write about them. We write about the unhappy families.
Yep. And I think that lends, right? That lends insight into why it's so frustrating at times for authors when people assume, why do you only write about depressing stuff? Or I didn't realize you were such an effed up person. It's like, well, I don't write about the normal stuff because that's boring.
Right. Well, you don't have to write about, slashing and burning fathers, what is it, mother stabbers and father, daughter rapers or anything like that.
Yep.
To write about unhappy families, and unhappy families are unhappy in their own way. You just have to figure out what that unhappiness is and write about that.
That's right. All right. How about an underrated author that you'd like to give a shout out to?
God, there are a lot of underrated authors, aren't there? I mean,
yep.
Years and years ago, I went to a Penn Faulkner presentation where Dora Welty was the center queen, if you will. And, she was great. But Peter Taylor came up from Charlottesville. And Peter Taylor, I used to tell students, Peter got Faulkner's job at UVA when Faulkner left, which is kind of true, kind of isn't, kind of compresses some facts. But anyway, he was there. And Susan Shreve, who's a writer who doesn't get enough attention, but I did a good interview with her not long ago for her most recent novel, which was a lot of fun. But she called up Peter because she'd studied with him at UVA, and she said, "Would you like to come up and introduce Dora Welty?" And he said, "Oh yeah, I'd love to come up and introduce Dora." So he comes up and he introduces her. And after the event, Welty is surrounded by everybody, and he's just standing there leaning against the wall. So I got out of the outer ring of the admiring Welty clan, which was a great place to be, a lot of fun. She was just a wonderful, wonderful person. To listen to her talk informally was great.
Yeah.
But I went up and started talking to him, and he was like so you write, you compose on a typewriter or what? And I told him, yeah, I actually composed on a computer because I'd been a journalist. We learned how to do that in the course of my years. And he said, well, he might want to learn how to do that because he was old. He was getting older all the time, and he wanted to learn how to do that. But first, he had to learn how to compose on a typewriter because he wrote everything out longhand on legal pads. Then he typed it up so he could revise as he typed it up. And I said, well, that's a lot of typing. He said, yeah. And so he used these old Underwood kind of upright typewriters. He had trouble getting parts and ribbons for them. So he had to keep a couple of 3 on the closet that were ready to go. And the guy that always fixed them for him was retiring. So he'd taken all of them in and gotten them tuned up and told the guy, if you find any more, I'll take them. I'll just keep them in the closet, And he said, so it was just a great conversation about writers and methodologies and quirks and stuff like that, I mean, Taylor was there for a while, for your viewers here who might not know him. He was one of the, frequent contributors to the New Yorker, all the time in the New Yorker and other publications as well, but didn't get a lot of notice because he hadn't written a novel. And then he wrote what he thought would be a novel, but it turned out to be a novella, and wasn't quite there, didn't get the kind of attention. And then he wrote the novel Summons to Memphis, which was a really great novel and won all kinds of prizes, a Pulitzer and some other stuff. And he felt like, okay, he'd made it. But I still don't think that he was really understood. His stories were very novelistic. The simple notion is that a novel is multi-thematic and a short story is unithematic, but he would have the most interwoven plot lines and character lines and story development lines without breaking that mold of what a short story was. And always writing about manners. I mean, he was a good Southern writer, always writing stories of manners. Just an amazing writer.
He's one of those, and this is certainly true across the disciplines, like with musicians, when you pay attention to the writers you admire, especially ones from previous generations, the reverence that he's held in by all the heavy hitters, and I mean critics as well as novelists, speaks volumes. So I came to him early, probably because of you or any number of professors at Mason, but I was told at an impressionable age, read him. And over the years, so I concur with your assessment that one would think that he'd be kind of a bigger name, and yet it seems almost just about right for his whole personality and style that he's one that invokes lifelong fanaticism as opposed to kind of flavor of the month type.
Right.
So, yeah. Okay. So, all right, this next one is delightful because I know the answer, but the sub question is what's really going to be the meat of this one. I ask everyone, why have you not read Moby Dick? Or if you have, is there a classic you've been meaning to get around to? I know you've read Moby Dick, so we can dispense with that suspense.
Yes, I have read that. I haven't read as much Joyce as I should have, particularly some of the less accessible Joyce works that people are always talking about. I've been working lately with Chris O'Shea, who is the widow of Alan Chuse, a former colleague of mine. Alan had a wreck in California in 2015 and died of injuries. And Chris began writing, and she is doing a memoir. And she needed some other pairs of eyes on it, and I was one of the pairs that she asked to sort of take a look at it. And it looks like we're lining up that book to come out next summer. It's called Dancing to Words, and it's going to be. I think it's going to be really good. But it's her first and only book. But in there, she talks about Joyce and how mesmerizing his language was, the rhythm of language. I mean, one of the reasons that she and Alan were drawn to each other is that she loved Alan's writing. She heard him read, like the first week they met, she heard him read at a writer's retreat, an artist retreat out in California. And she just fell in love with that, sonorous tone and the evocation of language that he could do in his writing. And there's another, unsung hero of writing. And she just, she was a dancer, and she went to her studio at Jurassic, where the writing center where she was, and just started dancing, put together choreographed a dance based on the language that she was playing in her head,
Wow. Wow.
And she would do that, but she would do that with like Joyce. And it's like, God, I am so arrhythmic. I couldn't do that if I had to. So this has really made me reappreciate Joyce and the language. And I begin to understand the reason that I don't appreciate some of those works by Joyce is I'm looking at them more traditionally, and I need to be a little bit more innovative as a reader.
Yeah, there's another, right? I mean, there's cliches be damned. Joyce kind of always stays modern because, he was breaking the mold as he created the new mold. I think he's kind of like the Beatles, where people can say whatever they want, but you just can't get away from that influence.
Yeah.
There's probably a handful per generation that have the ability, much less the desire, to kind of reshape the way we write.
Right.
So I think his shadow looms large.
Yeah.
All right, turning back to you again, if you could identify, is there a single theme or topic that your own work tends to address?
Well, I'm working on some short stories now, and I've actually sort of begun to ask myself, why am I writing these stories as opposed to other stories? And the current stream of, there are like 3 stories that all have to do with these younger men trying to sort of find themselves or identify their course in life, if you will. After something has happened to them, or they're looking for something to happen, or they're anticipating that thing that's happening. But I've also plotted out in my head probably about 8 interwoven stories that really sort of could go as a book that draw together a lot of life themes of, when you look around at what's going on. It starts with, first story is called Grouper, at least in my moment of working on it, it's called Grouper. But because it starts in a therapy group, and this man and woman meet, and her mother died not too long ago, a year or so, and his just recently died like weeks ago, and he thinks he's healed, and he tells his individual therapy guy, his therapist, I'm done. I don't need any more. And the guy, Marvin, his therapist says, you got to at least do, group. So he goes into the group, but he's going crazy sitting in group because everybody's, about whatever. And he doesn't get the floor, and he's not going to assert himself. So he kind of chases down this woman who, when he finds out that her mother died, and he starts a conversation with her. So they become buddies, and it's sort of, goes on from there. So the 2 of them just encounter lots of things going on in the world today, and it sort of spins naturally out of that. But I'm really interested in this because it does allow you to bring in so many things that are going on. And I don't mean to be self-congratulatory, but I've never had this kind of launch, if you will, of an idea. So I feel really energized by it.
I think it's phenomenal. I mean, it's phenomenal creatively. It's phenomenal as an inspiration to anyone watching this, that the desire to write, the ability to write, part of it is, making it happen. You know how I feel, but I think that's cause for celebration for sure. So congratulations.
Well, as the aforementioned Alan Schuss always said, if you sit down every day and put your fingers over the keyboard, you'll get some words out.
Yep. And that is a perfect segue into the next kind of couplet of questions, which involve writing routine and writer's block. What is your take, if any, on either or both of those? And what have you done to initiate or repel the latter? Or has it changed over the years, et cetera?
When you work 16 or 17 years as a journalist, you learn there's no such thing as writer's block. You come in from a meeting that you've covered, and you've got to write a newspaper column inch a minute in order to meet the deadline. You don't really have time to study your notes or figure out, who's on first and what's on second. you just sort of got to write the lead and figure out how to hinge everything off of it, and you get pretty good at organizing it. I mean, there are a lot of rules. If you know anything about inverted pyramid style, there are a lot of rules that you can work with, and a lot of formulas. But the thing is, just sitting down and start typing, and and you got to do it. And so that was when I really sort of learned how to write, and to just sort of string the words together in here and have them flow through the fingers. So writer's block's never been an issue. I will let myself get distracted. When I was at Mason running the program, I'd often say, well, I've got to go to the office because I got to do 5 things by the second cup of coffee, and then I got a little quiet time so I can write there, and I would sometimes. Dean of the college came to me after the snipers in DC, and he wanted to do a book analyzing the news coverage, and he asked me to write a journalistic chapter that sort of looked at that, and then sort of go through the whole thing and drop in segments. And so I said, sure. And so that kind of project that really is interesting will get me away from fiction, but it's still writing, and it's still doing something that I felt like was important. So I guess I'm always writing, and I've never seen any issue that posed for me writer's block. I do understand that there are people who say, well, I don't know what to write about, or I don't have an idea. But then it's like, well, just sit down and start making stuff up, and see where it leads.
Yeah.
I also know that there are crises of confidence, if you will, where what you're sitting down and doing, you just feel like it's not going to be the stuff you're going to send out that's going to win the hearts and minds of people everywhere. Well, a lot of what we put down isn't going to win the hearts and minds of people anywhere. But that doesn't mean it's not going to lead to something. It doesn't mean that you don't do it. You just have to accept the reality of the situation, that most words you put down, you're probably going to take them out at some point. But you got to keep putting them in so you can take them out. And it's all a process.
I feel like mature writers actually look at the fact that most of what we write, at least initially, is going to be lousy as liberating. And I think pretenders or wannabe writers look at that as an insurmountable, like, what, I've got to do all this work. And it's like, what endeavor does anyone, an athlete, like, what does anyone do where they're like, no, I put in the time and I'm pretty great all the time? It's like, there's nothing. So I find that writers that kind of get it, that I think that frees you to write badly, because it's usually through revision that, the crux of the matter reveals itself. And there's an art to that as well.
Well, that's right. And you've got to figure out where the crux is. And I oftentimes write toward what I think the crux is, and find out, halfway there that it's actually over this way somewhere or that way somewhere, and not where I thought it was. And I don't mean to insult anybody, but you have the student who drinks 14 cups of coffee and takes some kinds of pills, and and then sits down to write a story from beginning to end all the way through, and brings it to workshop and says, isn't it brilliant? And they really they're so hyped up on their own words that they really don't want to hear anything. And unfortunately, it makes them kind of uneducable. And it also makes them probably uneditable. So I don't quite know how that's all going to work out for them. I wish them the best.
It's fascinating too, Bill, that you invoked Peter Taylor earlier and the legal pad. You and I both. I'll call us, for lack of a contemporaries of a sort, in that we were certainly pre-internet as we came of age. Right. And so for me, in the early days, even to get to the typewriter, much less a computer, it was like it was this weird privilege. And I don't know if a teacher told me this or I actually thought it to myself, but there was this notion, almost a religious, like, it has to be at a certain level before you even put it into form. And I do think one potential drawback for younger writers is it just looks better in typewritten. If you write something as a draft and print it out to revise it, it looks done. Where when you work on a legal pad and you see all the detritus and all the false starts, and I do think there's something, like, I don't envy, on balance, I don't envy the younger generation, or the ease of everything from acquiring music to writing drafts, because I think you get the sense that it's baked when it needs a lot more time to get.
Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, I used to tell students all the time that, it's great that they can see it looking so pretty, but they really have to interact with it differently from the way you and I did. And part of learning how to write in that environment is learning how to interact with it in a productive sort of way.
I love that. I love that way you put that. Interact with. You have to interact with your stories.
Yeah, you have to. Yeah.
Yeah. You got to get in there and get to know it.
Yeah.
All right. How about a setback? It doesn't have to be artistic or otherwise, that looking back might have put you on the trajectory that you found yourself on.
That's interesting. My parents both died when I was in my late 20s. And I think that's one reason why journalism sort of played out. I mean, I sort of said earlier, it had a lot to do with the people I was covering, and to some degree it did, the people and events. But I think the other reason that made me want to write more substantively than newspapers, my phrase for it around the time was that journalism was about chronicling the externalities, and I was interested in the internalities. And part of it was, I was an orphan by the time before I was 30,
Yeah.
And one of the things, this goes back to Chris O'Shea's memoir about Alan, one of the things that she delves into a bit in a show don't tell kind of way is grief, and how grief can turn to anger. When you're in your 20s, you have a lot of stuff you haven't worked out with your parents yet. And when they exit your world, you're not able to work any of that out. So what do you do with it? And there's some unconscious piece of yourself that says, I'm just going to have to work that out on my own, I guess. And, and so I think that was what drew me to writing more seriously. And I think that leads into some of the themes in answer to that question, it ties back to that as well.
Well, I'd also imagine that you were kind of, preternaturally a kind, generous fellow, but I wonder if that also deepened this capacity for teaching and giving that's really defined your whole life, the reason so many people admire you so much.
Well, possibly. I think I have an empathetic nature. That served me well as a journalist, because I could understand anybody's perspective, anybody's point of view, and could render that in an article about them. Or if I was looking at two sides in a debate, I could interview both sides and could present those fairly. So everybody went home happy. Everybody's mother is what we always talked about. Like, nobody ever reads all of an article except the guy's mother, so everybody's mother could read it and say, well, at least they presented, my kid's side of it honestly, and it's really up to the reader to decide now. But I was talking to my wife, in fact, not long ago, and I was talking about how unempathetic my father was. And I didn't use that term when I was a teenager growing up, and we would have our political discussions, and he and I were always on opposite sides, but he was just unempathetic. So I don't know where it came from, but I've always been a kind of an empathetic person, and it wasn't purely genetic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and I'll just quickly add, I have to imagine, what a gift. First of all, your intelligence to absorb that ability, but what a great gift for a fiction writer to understand empathy. I mean, you have to kind of have it, but to understand how important that is to the creative act, because I think you probably, as a teacher, you probably saw myriad examples of someone that knew exactly who the good guy was and what the point was, and it was a political screed. And part of what makes fiction interesting, right, is this notion of at least understanding that there are different motivations for acts that appear very one-sided, et cetera, et cetera. But I imagine your journalistic background certainly didn't hurt in terms of your sensibility as a writer.
No, that's right. And the empathy came through too, when I would have to tell that student very gently, okay, you've got to open this up a bit. You've got to let the story flower. You've got to let us believe in this character. You can't make us want to go out and lynch him,
Right. Yep. All right. So how would you, Bill, define or explain what literary success means to you?
Well, for myself, I would say I'd like to publish more than I have. I'd like to publish broadly, which is one reason why I think I stepped back from the Mason program to give myself time to try to do that. Um, and I just, I was having a heck of a good time at Mason, and I could have gone on doing that. They don't have required retirement ages, and I still had a lot of mental and physical energy. Um, and it would have been fun. And I will say that Greg Wilhelm, who followed me, kind of picked up right where I left off. He's starting a kind of an umbrella program that will link together all the things that I individually got started, and that was like my next step. And when we were talking about it, I was like, this is what needs to happen next. I think, feel free to do whatever you want. But he agreed with that, and he's putting that in place. It's called Watershed Lit, and it will tie together Fall for the Book and Stillhouse Press and the student journals, Phoebe and So to Speak, and it'll also, bring in the creative writing program and the Choose International Writers Center, all under one umbrella, so they can share resources, but also information. And a lot of those things were started when I was there, and I had a direct hand, if not the energizing hand, to get them started. So I just feel like that program is really starting to accomplish what I got it going to do. Meanwhile, I can step back and I can serve on the board of the Chief Center. I can give advice to Fall for the Book, and I can help Chris with the memoir, and I can write my own stories, and I don't have to go to Zoom meetings, and I miss teaching. I really, really miss teaching. I think that's one reason I've greatly enjoyed working with Chris on this book. It's like, well, see, we're gonna structure this about juxtapositions. We're not going to fill in every gap. We're going to let the reader fill in that gap, and we're not going to say everything. Reading all these memoirs where I felt like the writer, even some famous ones of memoirs, just sort of overstated the case. And I said, let's, and that just fit with her voice. And I said that, fits with your, so I felt like, I was kind of teaching her as we went along, and she'd say, I learned a lot. So it's like an ongoing class. So I'm still teaching.
Absolutely. And listen, I mean, I'm so delighted for you that you had the wisdom, because I know, I mean, I don't really, you can articulate it clearly better than I can, but I know how good you were at teaching, how much you loved it, how much the students loved you. But I'm just glad that you have been able, or you were willing, right, to focus on yourself a little bit. Because I think the one thing everyone would say about you is you put other people, the needs of the program first, and it has flowered in so many beautiful ways, and you get to see that legacy. But I just love that you're able to also kind of look at your navel a little bit, because you certainly earned that right.
Well, thank you.
Right.
The program has had some amazing alumni, both at the BFA, we started a BFA, but at the undergrad and the grad level. I mean, it's just amazing what that program has turned out.
Yeah, and not for nothing, I think, I just think about my own good fortune. I mean, just the writers that taught me, and I can't obviously speak to other schools, and I nor would I want to compare, but I know I can say the data is there, and it's very easy to extrapolate. Wow, was that program full of? And we talk about Susan Shreve and Alan before he died, and Bausch today. These writers that were doing it then, were doing it all along, and are still doing it today. I mean, and in addition to having a real passion for the students. I mean, not to say that it's a rinse, wash, repeat, but it's just, to me, from the outside looking in, of course, there's been some amazing alums, because it attracted good writers and shaped good writers. So that's part of your legacy too, which as an alum of the school, I'm always been delighted to watch that and celebrate it.
And of course, we went through changes. Writers retired. I mean, Susan has retired, and that was the occasion of my interview for Fall for the Book back in October, based on her new novel. Steve is in the process of retiring. Steve Goodwin, who was a protege of Peter Taylor. So these things, go full circle. And now, Tanya James is there, Courtney Burkich is there, Tim Denevi in nonfiction, Kyoko Mori in nonfiction. I mean, we've got two writers in nonfiction, where we started with like a half-time person in nonfiction. I mean, we got resources from the university that we really needed at a time when we needed them. And that's amazing, because Mason has always been short of everything it needed. And that we got the resources we did really speaks highly of the administration's appreciation for what we were doing with the art of language over in creative writing. And that we were able to bring in, and this is to your point, when those faculty members got better offers that Mason couldn't match, and when they just felt like they needed to go somewhere else, we were able to bring in younger writers with as much potential and fill those positions and keep on going, and bring in people of integrity and talent and significant promise at the same time. That just speaks to the quality of the program, but also the fact that that you can do that you can build that with a solid foundation and just sort of build on that foundation.
Indeed. And it's going to be fun, I think, for all of us to see how that continues to build and evolve. And certainly 1455 is always, I've been delighted to meet Greg. And of course, I still went to grad school with Deb. 1455 is, and, it's my alma mater. So there's a lot of good synergy there that I'm more than, now I'm more than just a fan. I'm active participant in that success. So that gratifies me greatly.
And if I could just, say I'm glad to see that synergy. One of the things that I see is that on the standpoint of events, literary events, we have not been able to get, any of us that I know of, the kind of audience that we get when you can get people in the same room. You don't get that kind of enthusiasm, but some of the participants that you've gotten have been amazing just to sort of, pay attention to and to notice. I mean, it's just because, if a writer can talk for you in the morning and talk for me in the afternoon at Fall for the Book or something like that, and not have to leave home, that's just great. Whereas before, they'd have to get on a plane and wherever, fly to, DC, do your event, then do my event, and then, stay over someplace and then fly back. And that's a different level of interruption in their life.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping that we can all learn something from this and can provide readers around the world with opportunities to share, and that they will learn to appreciate, and come to appreciate those kinds of opportunities, and that we can spread the appreciation of reading and writing more easily without disrupting the writers themselves.
So I wholeheartedly agree. And I'll say that I think, we're seeing this profound disruption in 2020, but what I think it's showing us is we hope and assume that semi-normalcy will return at some point, and of course we'll go back to more intimate gatherings that are so irreplaceable. But what I think this has really opened up for those of us that plan events is, the barrier to entry for both talent and audience has really been broken down, and that's an opportunity for us to take advantage fully of a quality of speaker that maybe would have been impossible to reach, but also bring a wider, more diverse audience. And that's just a win-win.
Right. Totally. I don't mean to keep talking about things I've done, but, the interview with Susan Shreve, we had people coming in from Europe, several European countries. And, that was just amazing, to see people doing that. And they could never have gotten over to the States for an hour and a half long interview, 6-hour plane ride one way, 8 hours the other.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think what those of us, anyone can appreciate. First of all, these things require a budget, but even with an literally, which is inconceivable, but say you had an unlimited budget, you're still going to run up against the human factor of someone saying, I don't care if you're going to put me on a first class and pay me and put me up at the Four Seasons. I don't feel like traveling. Where I don't have to leave my living room and can drink a cocktail and do this event and reach potentially a wider audience and sell more books. I just don't look at it as a compromise. I look at it as a real genuine opportunity that is maybe a generational shift that I think can have both going forward. So, yeah, I mean, call me a romantic, but I really believe that. I think despite what's been a very challenging year, obviously on so many levels,
Right.
one silver lining that's come out of this is, I think, for the artist community, realizing, wow, the world is a big place, but it's smaller when we have technology to kind of help it along.
Exactly. Yeah. And, like you said, out of the disruption comes innovation, and out of the innovation can come improvement.
Right on. All right. Closing words from the master. There's so many people that didn't have the good fortune I had to be sitting in front of you in a classroom, but a 1 to 2 minute exhortation for an aspiring writer looking for advice.
If you are an aspiring writer, the two most important things you can do are write and read. Nobody else can put those words on the page for you or on the screen for you. You've got to do it yourself, and you've just got to sit down on a periodic basis and do it. I think the best way to do it is to sit down for a couple of hours every day. And even if, I think it was either Flannery O'Connor or Dora Welty, and I'm at the moment not sure which, maybe even both of them, would go, and they would, every morning at a certain time, they would go sit down and wait for the spirit to move them and tell them what words to put down. And if nobody showed up, the spirit didn't show up, they were still there, and I think that's important. And sometimes I know that O'Connor would bring out something to read if she didn't feel like writing. And sometimes she would, and particularly after she was publishing a lot, she would get a lot of letters from people. There's a famous correspondence about A Good Man Is Hard to Find, and from a teacher of that story who was offering an interpretive possibility for it. And she was so incensed that, she had to write him back and tell him how wrong-headed he was. And so the thing was that, she would start writing correspondence, and it would give her an idea for a story. So she would put the correspondence aside and begin work on the story. So the point is, if you're afraid of being bored while you're sitting there, and, therefore you stay away, bring something to read, which brings up my second point: read. Find some writers whose work you admire and whose work you think you connect with, that would be kind of like the work you'd like to do. Not that you want to emulate it, but you want to sort of be inspired by it. You want to get familiar with it. And maybe in your writing time, you don't put any words of your own down, but you analyze theirs, and maybe even diagram their plot structures, or you analyze their characters and think about how they did what they were doing. And if in the other hours of the day you're off having to work for a living, or you're, whatever you're having to do, tend to kids or whatever, it's really important to keep those couple of hours that you set aside for writing sacred, So use it for reading, use it for making notes, use it for actual putting one word after the other that might frame a story. But keep that time really sacred and really key to you. And if you do that, your chances of success will go from around 10 or 15% to around 80 or 90%. It really, really makes a difference if you can immerse yourself on a consistent basis over time and time again. Do that. You will greatly increase your opportunities of success.
And there it is. The final word. We ran a little long, and I couldn't be happier. I had a feeling that, in addition to enjoying it myself, I think this is a real service for writers of any level, but certainly the younger writers, getting to hear, some real kind of wisdom from the trenches. And I'll note in closing that it's so appropriate that the door is open behind you, because all the years that I walked those halls at Mason, if there was ever a professor that was known for having an open door policy that I certainly probably took more advantage of than I should have, it was you. So allow me to go on record as saying profound gratitude for the patience, the passion, and just, again, the kindness of recognizing the sparks in the young acolytes that wanted to do better, and encouraging them. I never heard a word for you that wasn't encouraging. And I've talked to a lot of people alma mater and friends that all say the same thing. So Bill, on behalf of all of us former pupils, a life well spent that's very much still in progress. So it's just a wonder and a joy to chat with you.
Well, thank you very much. And I can assure you, nobody enjoyed it any more than I did.
And it's clear. Yeah. I mean, the testimony of a life well lived is someone that can articulate why they're happy and doing what they want to do. It's a blessing, but your blessing has always gone outward, and you've kind of given of that happiness, and it is contagious.
Cool.
So to be continued, because as I'm fond of saying here, it's like the mafia. Once I get you in some kind of event at 4055, you never get back out.
Okay.
So we will talk more soon, my friend.
Okay.
All right. Talk to you soon, Bill. Take care.
Okay.